So we will talk today. So we will talk today about Chapter 1, and we'll get into kind of this discussion about what economics is. A lot of you come in with differing ideas about what is economics. If this was class, I usually go around the room and I ask students to define what they think economics is. I've done this a while. I know what to expect. What I usually will get is they believe economics is about two things: money, or this term they heard, supply and demand. Those are what we will talk about with economics, but that's not really what economics is about. So we're going to talk in this Chapter 1, kind of give us this really big overview about what economics is. So we're going to talk about what kind of questions as economists we address. And we're going to talk about how do people make decisions, kind of how do people interact, and kind of what are the principles about the economy and how it works on a kind of a whole. This will be a very kind of generic 50-minute discussion about economics. We're not going to get into a lot of nitty-gritty details about certain economic principles. The goal is just kind of to give you kind of what they sometimes refer to it as kind of a sampler platter. We're going to kind of sample what areas we're going to look at, and as the semester goes along, we're going to get deeper into some of these areas. So the main idea behind economics is we're going to study how society manages its scarce resources. So we're going to look at how do people decide how to allocate resources. What do you do? Why do you do that? What's the cost and what's the benefit of doing certain activities? So we're going to spend a lot of time talking about in this class about that kind of discussion. So the first idea behind economics is we have this idea that resources are scarce. And because they're scarce, what that means is that they're limited. But what do I mean by limited? Well, limited means I can't have all that I want to have. The book uses the term wish. I prefer the term want. I can't have everything that I want. There is some limit to resources. So if I would go around the room and I would ask students what percentage of resources in this world are scarce. And usually I get some student will say somewhere between, 60%. And someone will say 75. Occasionally I'll get 80. And then I'll ask the students, all right, you told me 80% of the resources are scarce. That means 20% are not. Give me an example of a resource that isn't scarce. And I'll let them sit there and I'll let them think. And rarely can they ever come up with a resource that's not scarce. Because the answer to that is I've only ever been able to come up with one. You can have all the air you wish to have. Go for it. Have it all. Now, clean air is limited, but air in general is not. So the only resource that is not scarce is air. And because you can have all that you want, there is no limit to it. But there is a limit to other things. And because almost all resources are scarce, when we talk about how do we manage scarce resources, that means as economists, we talk about anything. We can apply these tools anywhere. Business, we can talk about it through sports if you wish. Education, government. There isn't a limit to where economics can't delve into and how we can use our tools to help explain parts of the world. And that's often why we're referred to as general education class, is because we're not just talking about business. We're going to talk about sports examples. I have education examples. I have government examples. There are examples in biology. I'm just not as good there. But there are examples of economics being used all over. So what are some of kind of the principles behind economics? So the first thing we're going to look at is we're going to look at how people make decisions. And when people make decisions, we have about 4 basic principles. We face trade-offs, there's an opportunity cost, we think at the margin, and we respond to incentives. So what do we mean by people face trade-offs? Principle 1 and principle 2 are very, very similar. Principle 2 is just going to give us the name of what we give up. But principle 1 just talks about we have this trade-off. Everything we do in this world requires a trade-off. Some of the examples we use. If I go to a party the night before an exam, that means I chose a party over studying. Now, my job as an economics professor is probably to encourage more studying than partying, but that's a choice you make. Everything we do, we have to give up something, because if I go to a party, it's probably not to study economics. So there's this trade-off. Having more money to buy stuff, that means I have to work more. And if I work more, that means I have less time off to probably enjoy it. So there's this trade-off of work and leisure. There's a trade-off with the environment. Is that if I want to protect the environment, I'm going to have to give up things to protect it. There's always this discussion of pollution. And there are no economists I know of that talk about zero pollution. Why? Because we recognize that there's going to be a cost. There are certain things that people will never give up in order to have zero pollution. So probably my example of, well, there will always be pollution is air conditioning. I know air conditioners pollute, but I am never giving up my air conditioner. It is too hot in Arkansas not to have an air conditioner. But I know by having an air conditioner, I'm creating problems with pollution. But that's a trade-off as an individual I'm willing to make. And we all have those trade-offs, whether it's how we spend our time, how we utilize our resources, such as time, and how we protect the environment. So as economists, probably our biggest discussion about government policies is we like to talk about kind of these 2 goals behind government policies. Most government policies either try to make the world more efficient or try to make the world more equal. You can't make them both. I can't make the world more efficient and more equal. So there's always a trade-off. Now, if you go back in economic history, they talk about capitalism and socialism. At its very core, capitalist societies are purely efficient. All they're looking for is how do I get the most out of my scarce resources? And socialist economies, at their very basic core, is they want to talk about how are things most equal? How do I distribute prosperity equally among society members? So as economists, or at least as myself, I like to think about efficiency and equity as pie. So when we talk about efficiency, as I'm talking about how big of a pie I can make. So if I'm really efficient, I might make a huge pie. Okay, I'm just not then worried about how it's sliced. So what might happen with efficiency is I might have this really big kind of slice. I might have this little narrow slice. I might have a slice that looks like that. I might have a slice that looks like that. And I might have a slice that looks like that. So that's how it's distributed. Now, equality is I'm not worried about how big of a pie I make. I just want to make sure it's equal. So what happens is if we're worried about equality, my pie size shrinks. But if you look, my slices are more equal. So there's a trade-off. If I want to get greater equality, I have to redistribute my pie. I have to take from the wealthy and give to the poor to make my pie a little more equal. Now, the hard question is this little sliver of pie here, I'm getting very, very little of this pie. How does that compare to this piece? Right? Which piece is better? Would I have a little sliver of a huge pie or an equal piece of a small pie? Which one gives me more resources, goods and services? And that's a debate we often have among government officials. Almost all government policies are talking about efficiency and equality. And some people might argue that a very small piece of that big pie is a whole lot more than that small piece of that equal pie. Some might say it's better to have the equal pie than the big pie. As economists, we don't have a lot of discussion about it from an economic standpoint. Now, we have a different discussion about what I value, but that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about, do you want to be more efficient or equal? And if I want to be more equal, I'm going to have to understand I'm going to get a smaller pie. And I might get less resources for every individual than if I had a really big pie that has a small sliver. And that's what I'm willing to accept. I don't get the big pie cut equally. That's not what I can get. I have to decide what I'm willing to trade. Because anytime we take from the wealthy to the poor, what happens is I shrink my pie. Because those who are efficient are going to be less efficient if I take from them more than before. So we have this trade-offs we have to make. And if you look at almost any government policy, that's the decision they're making. Do we want more efficient or more equal? So what we're going to talk about now is the cost. So there's an opportunity cost. That means what I must give up to obtain a certain item. So opportunity cost, the best way to look at it is, let's look at it as your college education. So what does it cost you to go to school? Well, definitely cost of going to school, tuition, books, fees. No one argues those. Those are easy. So those are all costs to go to school. Now, what about room and board? Is that a cost of going to college? The answer to that is no. Room and board alone isn't a cost of going to school. But Dr. Walsh, it tells me on my bill, I see my bill, I live in the dorms, it says, sure enough, there's a cost of room and board. And the answer is yes, you do pay a cost of room and board. But the economist thinks kind of more deeply at the problem. If you didn't pay the college to live there, what would you do? Well, I'd have to pay somewhere to live. So there's always a room and board expense whether you went to college or not. When we talk about room and board for college expenses, it's the extra college costs for room and board. So if I went to the University of Arkansas Fort Smith, I have no idea what the numbers are, and I paid $10,000 in room and board. However, if I didn't go to school, it would only cost me $7,000 for room and board. If that's the scenario, then we would call room and board would only be $3,000. So going to college costs you $3,000 extra in room and board. So that would be an expense to college. So going to college costs tuition, books, fees. We'll call the excess for room and board. And probably the most expensive part of going to college isn't tuition, books, fees, room and board. It's the time you have to give up. The value of your time that you spend going to college is the most expensive part of college. If you didn't go to college, you could work a whole lot more. Some of you try to work a whole lot more instead of going to college, and you have to see me more than once. But what we want to do is we want to make sure that I don't see Dr. Welshide more than once, at least in Principles of Macro. And so I'm going to have to make sure that I put the time in class and studying and doing the work rather than working. And when I do that, it comes at a cost. And it comes at a significant cost. Right? You're supposed to spend somewhere between 9 and 10 hours a week doing econ. Yeah, I know it's a lot, but that's the typical time. If you weren't doing econ, you could have been working. We'll just take an easy $10. 16 weeks for the class. So the cost you pay for econ isn't just tuition, isn't just the book, isn't just the fee, isn't just the room and board, but it's also the value of your time. And if we look at it, usually is the most expensive part of this class is the time. So please take that in mind, is that part of the cost of anything is what you give up to get in. That's the value of your time. So another example, not using college, we can look at the opportunity cost of going to the movie. It's not only what you pay for the movie, but it's also what else you could have done with your time. So I went to see a movie, it cost me $10 and 2 hours of my time. That has a value. So remember, when we talk about cost in this class, we're not only going to focus on what comes out of your pocket. That's what most people think about cost, is what comes out of your pocket. But it is also this value of your time, or the value of the resources you use. What else could I have done with this if I didn't do this? So those are costs that we need to think about, and we need to make sure we account for when we have discussions. Next one, kind of going to follow along, is we're going to have rational people think at the margin. This is more of a micro issue. But we're going to talk a little bit about it in macro. Thinking at the margin is small incremental adjustments. At the margin, when you get to micro, the term I use is one more. What is a marginal cost? What is a marginal benefit? Well, what does one more get me? What does one more cost me? So rational people think at the margin. So let's kind of look at an example here. Okay, so these are kind of the examples of thinking at the margin. So as the manager of a local Save-A-Lot, you are thinking of hiring one more cashier. If I hire the cashier, they are able to get me another $400 in sales. And I'd have to pay the cashier $300 a week to work. Should I hire the cashier? Well, hopefully you all said yes. Why would I say yes? Well, I get $400 in benefit for hiring her. She only cost me $300. I'm up $100. I win. Right? I'm up $100. The value is positive. So that's kind of from a business perspective. I'll have to change my fees for Netflix since they just raised my cost. I think they're now $13 or $14 a month. But we'll say it's $12 a month. It doesn't matter. This could be $100. It doesn't matter what this cost is. But let's say it's $12 a month. I pay for Netflix. It doesn't matter how many movies or shows I watch, because it's an all-you-can-eat buffet of movies. So should I watch one more movie or episode? The answer is, what's the cost of one more episode? The cost of one more episode or movie is my time. Should I watch it? Well, it depends. What else could I be doing with my time? I could be studying econ. Probably not. But that would be a good use of your time. I could be exercising. I could be reading a book. I could be sleeping. The answer is whether I should watch one more movie on Netflix is, what did I give up to watch that movie? And if that's the best use of my time, or brings me the most enjoyment is watching the movie, then that's what I should do. But watching the movie requires me to give something up. So here's just kind of the examples. So for all these questions I have on my slides, you should answer them just like I did. Write them down before you look at the answers. See if you can get the correct answers before you actually look. But I always provide the answers afterwards so you can check your work. So just like we talked about, 400 in sales, 300 for the new cashier. She's a benefit, I hire her. Netflix. There is some benefit of me watching the movie, the enjoyment. Monetary cost is 0, but there is a cost of time. And because of the cost of time, that depends. Is this enjoyment more than what else I could be doing? And if it is, I watch the movie. If it's not, I should be doing that other activity. Principle 4 is people respond to incentives. No shock. That one's probably the most no, that shouldn't be shocking at all. We all know people respond to incentive. What's an incentive? Something that makes a person act. So there's lots of examples of incentives. Gas prices rise. I buy more hybrid, less SUVs. They raise the cigarette tax. Teen smoking falls. That doesn't go to 0, it goes down. We'll talk about that later. That's called the law of demand. But we see these kind of things occur. Is that when I create an incentive, people respond to that incentive. One of the examples, if you're reading the book, probably one of my favorite examples are seatbelt laws. So seatbelt laws are supposed to prevent people from dying. And why do they prevent people from dying? Well, because if I wear my seatbelt, I'm safer in my car. Science proves that's to be the case. If I wear my seatbelt, I'm safer in my car. So if I forced everyone to wear a seatbelt in their car, everyone should be safer. That's how the theory goes. But just because I make people wear a seatbelt doesn't mean I dictate their safety level. So what happens is people have a certain level of safety they're willing to accept. By making them wear a seatbelt, they aren't all of a sudden going to have a lower level of safety. They're still going to be just as risky as they always have been. But because I now have forced them to wear a seatbelt, what they decide to do is they decide to behave in other risky activities. So they'll drive faster, or they'll drive more recklessly. And because they're driving faster and more recklessly, what ends up happening is they get in more accidents. And when they get in more accidents, that nets out the probability of surviving. So if we had 1,000 accidents and people die in 1 out of 1,000 accidents, so only one person would die in this accident. Now we go a little safer, where one person dies in 2,000 accidents. But now I have 4,000 accidents. What will happen is 2 people will die. So sometimes creating laws changes incentives. And we found that with seatbelt laws. Is that in actuality, it didn't prevent people from dying. What we actually found was actually more deaths and more accidents. So surprisingly, things like seatbelt laws didn't actually make the world safer. it made us kind of worse off. So the answer to your question, Amber, sorry, I can't always check the chat because I don't quite see it. I wish I could find a way to do that. Yes, you can watch a movie and work out. You get a little bit of benefit of both. I don't know if you pay as much attention to the movie when you're working out, but you would get enjoyment of both. So yes, you can do multiple activities at once. Probably watching a movie and studying for ECON wouldn't be that good, but yes, we try to find ways to lower the cost of watching movies. That would be one way. One more principle. This one is probably one students struggle with the most. So I have this 1967 Chevy Impala. Yeah, no, it's an old car. Okay. I've already spent $2,000 fixing it up. Probably a whole lot more than that, but we're just going to say $2,000. All of a sudden, the transmission dies. And I'm going to have to pay $1,400 to repair it. Or I can sell the car as is. So what should I do? Well, here's the examples we have. I have the Blue Book value, so what I can sell the car for if the transmission works, and what I can sell it if it doesn't. So in scenario A, should I fix the transmission? Well, the answer is if I'm looking to sell the car right away, I take $1,400 plus $11,000, $1,200. That comes to $12,600, which is less than $1,450, $14,500. So I should fix the transmission. This assumes that I'm going to sell the car right away. So yes, I should fix the transmission. Well, I hear students in the background, well, what about these $2,000 in repairs? And the comment is, and that money's gone. There's nothing you can do about those $2,000. That money's already been spent. Okay? The decision we make today doesn't have any implications on those $2,000. That money's gone. We only care about what decisions I can change today. So here, on the second one, it would be $12,400, which is greater than the Blue Book value if the transmission doesn't work. So I would not fix the transmission. So that's kind of the examples there. The next three principles talk about how people interact. So we talk about trade, how trade makes everyone better off, how markets are a good way to organize economic activity, and how governments can, that is can, sometimes improve market outcomes. It doesn't say will, but they can. So let's talk about trade. There is no doubt people benefit from trade. And how I know that is because we all trade our goods and services. I said, we don't make all our own goods, right? We don't make all our own clothes. We don't make all our own food. We don't make all our own education. We don't do all our own taxes. We don't all make our own cars. Well, why not? Well, because if you ask me, we're not very good at all that stuff. Right? If I try to grow my own food, I'm horrible. Okay? If you want any evidence of that, you can come see my garden every summer. It's horrible. I try. I said, if I'm lucky, I get some cucumbers. Every now and then I get some tomatoes, and my wife's happy. But for the most part, I'm horrible at growing my own food. So I don't grow my own food. Well, how do I eat? What I do is I trade my services of teaching so I can buy food. So we trade all the time, goods and services. And when we talk about chapter 3, we talk about what do I specialize in? I specialize in what I can do at the lowest cost, what I do most efficiently. And then we do that and we trade with others. And just like it works for people, it works for countries. So countries as a whole benefit from trade. Doesn't mean everyone in the country benefits with trade and specialization. The country as a whole does. However, there might be some individuals who do not benefit from trade with countries. But if we added up everyone in the country as a whole specializes and becomes better off. But individuals within that country may not be better off with more trade. You've kind of seen that if you paid attention to politics. There's been this discussion about trade in the last 4 years. There's been some discussion of who benefits and who doesn't benefit from trade. And we'll focus a little bit of this on chapter 3. We'll get into some discussion about trade. Principle 6. I think it's honestly the hardest concept for students to wrap their heads around. But you read it, you go, okay, I got it, Dr. Walsh. Markets are usually a good way to organize economic activity. I got it. Simple. How hard is that? It's hard because it doesn't feel right. Because if you think about markets, markets are a group of lots of buyers and sellers, millions upon millions, interacting with one another to organize economic activity. So you got to think about it. There's lots and lots of people in this world all getting together to create goods and services. And if you think about who's in charge of a market, you really have no one in charge. An overall market, there's really no one's in charge. Well, how does a market work? How does it determine what goods and services to produce? How much? Who? Who buys it? Who sells it? When you really start to think about how a market works, it's almost kind of miraculous. Now, we've lived through it, and we live in the United States. We have kind of grown up with it. It's hard to see kind of the miracle of markets, right? Markets allocate resources through decisions, decentralized decisions of many firms and households. It doesn't feel like it should work, right? Wouldn't it be better if we had someone in charge of the market, a really smart person who could decide how to allocate resources? And they would come in and they would tell us what we can and can't produce, how much we should produce, because they had all this information about how the world works. That person doesn't exist. And because that person doesn't exist, the next best way is to let no one decide. What? A market economy works because people are self-interested and rational. So we have created a system where people care mostly about themselves and are rational individuals. And that's the way we became prosperous. Sit there and think of that then. I put a bunch of greed in this world, and because of a bunch of greed, we've created this system of huge prosperity. The United States was pretty much built on a market economy, one of the richest countries in the world. It's just almost hard to believe. It's this principle, it was originated by Adam Smith. And it's easy to describe. It's really hard for you to understand how miraculous this is. Because most of us grew up in the United States. Back in the 80s, there was this old country called the Soviet Union, highly communist country. So some of their leaders would come over to the United States, and they would come to visit. And they would come to the United States to visit. And they would tour the United States. They'd come, they do the typical tour, song and dance show, see all our great monuments, see the Golden Gate Bridge, Empire State Building, Grand Canyon, Mount Rushmore. They'd see it all. And then they would go home and they would talk about the most fantastic thing they saw in the United States. And they would write this in their diaries. What about the United States was the most unbelievable thing they saw? And here's the most unbelievable thing they saw. Something you probably see every day. A grocery store. What is special about a grocery store? I go to Walmart, right? How many of you go to Walmart and walk into Walmart and go, oh, wow, this is miraculous? Nobody. Nobody walks into Walmart and thinks this is the most miraculous place on the face of the earth. Ain't nothing special about it. I've been in it my whole life. You don't just go, oh. You aren't in utter amazement. You just walk into Walmart. It's Walmart. I go and I get my items. So why did these people from the Soviet Union think it was so miraculous? Well, because they walked down the bread aisle. And what did they see on the bread aisle? They saw wheat. They saw white. They saw multigrain. They saw 17 different brands. And the shelves were full. And they're thinking to themselves, how? In our country, we have people who have to tell people to make bread. And they have to tell them what to do. And they tell them how much bread to make. And we never have enough. We come to the United States, and you have a movie star president in charge. And I go to your grocery store. I go where you buy bread, and you have more than enough. And you have nobody telling people to make bread. They just make bread because they want to. Well, they don't make bread because they want to. They make bread because they want to get paid. And they want to buy more resources. So, Carly, very quickly, you had these people, and it's like Walmart. Well, you're going, it's Walmart. They just never got it. Now you understand why they think it's so fantastic. Is we grew up with it. Walmart's Walmart. Yeah, there's 17 different types of bread. It's what I've noticed. It's hard for us to see kind of the miraculous part of markets because it's what we've grown up with. It doesn't seem miraculous. It seems kind of boring. But it's this idea that no one's in charge, yet we have more than enough. And we have more than enough because there's somebody out there making bread who's figured out, if I make bread like this and sell it, somebody's going to want to buy it. And they aren't making bread because that's what they want to do. It is what they want to do. It's decide what they're best at. And because they wanted to do it, they're going to make the best bread possible to make them the most amount of money. And they do it over and over, and people start to buy their bread, and they get lots and lots of resources. There's no government official telling them how to make bread. They do it because they found a way to do it. And they did it because they're self-interested. And it's kind of strange. We have an economy that's greed. It's based on self-interest, greed. We'll just be honest about what it is. Self-interested is just a fancy way to say it. But in order for me to survive, or for me to succeed in life, and in reality, we actually have an economy based on service. In order for me to make a living, I have to serve someone else. And I have to serve someone else well. Because if I don't serve someone else well, I'll no longer be able to make a living myself. And so, yes, even though I'm self-interested, I still have to serve. And so it's kind of this strange mixture when we talk about the United States economy. Even though we're greedy, but we still have to serve others. Because if I don't give a good experience, people will go other places. And if they go other places, I no longer have a job. And if I no longer have a job, I no longer have food on my table. So we have this strange interaction of the world. It doesn't feel right. And when we really look at it, we kind of shrug our shoulders about how did that work? And why does that work? That's kind of where I talk about kind of this miraculous idea about it working. It just does. And it's kind of scary how well it works. Now, because we have some problems with self-interest, there is a role for government. And one of the main roles for government is to enforce property rights. Right? Is to enforce rules and maintain institutions. The role of the government is to protect me, is to protect what we call my property rights. So if I develop a new idea, someone can't steal my goods and services and sell them for their own. They have to go out and they have to develop their own things. And that's part of what the government's responsible for. That's the main job of the police, the firefighters, the courts, is their job is to protect and enforce property rights. So we want to make sure that I have the right of what I produce so no one else can steal it from me. So what I produce, people will buy, and I'm able to survive and thrive in my market. So that's one of the roles of government, is to enforce property rights. Another way governments can be involved is they can promote efficiency. So there might be some problems with market power, as there might be this single person who tries to have substantial influence on the market. And when you get into microeconomics, there is some of this power of monopoly. Now, again, it's not as big as we think, but there might be some role of businesses taking away power from individuals. And usually they have market power because the government gives it to them, surprisingly. But there is a role for government in trying to alleviate market power. But probably the bigger one governments need to worry about is things called externalities. These are market failures. And one of these is pollution. We talked about before, the government can't prevent all pollution. But what it needs to do is it needs to make me aware of my pollution. So I love my air conditioner. And because I love my air conditioner, I know it's going to be polluting. But since I do damage to the rest of the world, I need to pay for my damages. Yeah, it doesn't sound right. But if I'm a polluter, I need to pay for polluting as I'm harming the rest of the world. And you didn't choose to be harmed. You got harmed because I decided to run my air conditioner. And because of that, I need to pay for what I do. And if I pay for how much pollution I use, I won't pollute as much. Doesn't mean I'll go to zero. I'm still running my AC. But I'm going to have to pay for my pollution. So I may not run my air conditioner at 65. I might have to go up to 70 or 71 because at 65 I create too much pollution. I just can't afford to be at 65. So I might have to adjust my air conditioning. And one of the ways governments can do that is by examining or making sure I pay for my externalities. Externalities are the impact of one person's actions on the well-being of a bystander. So how I do something that harms someone else that didn't have anything to do with me. So there are negative and positive externalities. So government should try to discourage negative externalities such as pollution. Doesn't mean we get rid of them, but we should tax pollution. And there are positive externalities which the government should subsidize. So at least every day, most of you are engaging in, at least all of you are engaging in both a positive externality and a negative externality. Ambert's not quite paying my electric bill. It's slightly different with my AC. Because paying my electric bill is I'm paying for the cost of electricity. There's also a cost of pollution that comes about from me using the electricity. So there's two costs, right? Cost of me running the machine, and then the machine does damage outside. So we sometimes refer to those, they're right now, economists refer to them as carbon taxes. So if they talk about taxing carbon because the electricity is what I'm using, but I'm also creating carbon dioxide with using electricity, so I'm gonna have to pay for both. So that's sometimes what they talk about. Yes, it's mostly in the form of taxes, because that's all the government really can do. The government really can only tax us. Or they could regulate a different way and say I just can't use my AC, which is another way to do it, probably not the better way, but we should just make people pay for what they do. And the same thing works for positive externality. So for positive externalities, things like education. The government has two solutions to education. If you're in high school, they force you to go till you're 16 because education brings a positive externality. The more people are educated, the better off we are as society. So the government can force us to go to school, which it does till you're 16, or it can subsidize you, which it does when you go to University of Arkansas Fort Smith. You don't pay your full tuition bill. Yes, I know you see it on your bill. But what happens is the government is kicking in part of the bill. It would really cost $10,000 for you to go to University of Arkansas Fort Smith. You pay $6,000, the government's paying $4,000. So they're paying some of your bill. You may never see it, but the entire bill of going to UAFS is like $10,000. That's why private schools cost more than public schools, because the government isn't paying part of that tuition. So that's why they're always usually more expensive, is because the government isn't kicking in part of that tuition. Always the caveat I use just to say that governments can doesn't always mean they will, and sometimes they mess it up more than us. So we don't have time to go over this, but please go over these discussion questions yourself and go and talk about how does the government improve each of these outcomes and what's the role. Last principle we're going to go through very quickly because we're going to spend most of the rest of the class talking a lot about these. This is the macro part of the class. Like if I teach micro, I don't even talk about these at all because microeconomics doesn't talk about them. But these are the big principles of macro. A country's standard of living depends on its ability to produce goods and services. So does a person's. Prices rise when governments print too much money. We face a short-run trade-off between inflation and unemployment. So before we go, we'll talk a little bit about productivity. The last two are self-explanatory. I like to talk a lot about productivity. If you've been around the world or you've studied the world, you will notice that there are huge variations in living standards. Different places have different amounts of money. And we'll get to this in chapter 12, but it's almost kind of sad, is that the rich countries, the average income in rich countries is almost 10 times the average income in poor countries. So you think about the United States being poor, in reality and in the scope of the world, very, very few people in the United States are poor. We're poor relative to our citizens, but if we look at relative to the world, most people in the United States are very, very rich. And our living standards have improved significantly. It's one of the things I talk about. If you go back and you look at the first billionaire in the United States, Rockefeller, and I asked students, how many of you would trade places with Rockefeller? Oh, I have students raise their hand. Till I asked them, yeah, you live in a mansion, but you have relatively no AC, no electricity, no cell phone, no TV. How many of you want to live in that world? Quickly I go, ooh, not everyone. No, I like all that, and I'd rather be in a world where I have that than be a billionaire where I don't. So we think about today's living standards. It's amazing what almost our life has become and what the average American citizen has and how our lives have improved. Yeah, we might not have everything today. For the billionaires today are a lot richer than Rockefeller. Well, they have all this plus more. But the average citizen, if we look at it through history, what we've gotten as the average citizen in the United States due to productivity is nearly amazing. We don't sell our story enough. We don't sell what the average American has today compared to 100 years ago. compared to other countries. It's sometimes hard to look at what other countries have and don't have. Some of you will go overseas and see that. Some of you have been overseas and are here. And it's sometimes very stark difference between what's commonplace in the United States and what's commonplace other places. Last two principles, we talk about printing too much money. We see inflation. We don't always know when. The example I like to give about when is it too much money? It is too much money when we see inflation. I usually refer to it as drinking. Some of you may or may not have experience. When have I had too much to drink? Well, when I am falling down drunk. Well, why did you have too much to drink? Well, I didn't know that that next drink was going to leave me falling down drunk. Same thing works with governments and printing too much money. Well, when do they print too much money? Well, when there's lots of inflation. Well, do they know when that is? No, they don't. It's like drinking. Yes, we have science that tells us about when this should occur, but we never know when that last drink is going to push us over the edge. Same thing works with governments and printing too much money. And you can see that right now with the economic debate about is there too much money? Well, we don't really know when that tipping point will occur. And the last one, short-run trade-off between inflation and unemployment. If you can look at my slides, both the ones from the book and usually the ones I present, I bring kind of this chapter in a nutshell. I borrowed it from the book slides. It just gives you this kind of summary of what the slides were about. So when you go through your notes, make sure you can talk about how we do talk about trade-offs, how we talk about opportunity cost, marginal cost, incentives. Talk about interactions, and we talk about productivity. All right, are there any questions before we go today? I'm a little bit late, I apologize. I'm just a tad bit late.